Thank you, Chairman Cole, Ranking Member McGovern, and members of the Rules Committee, and thank you for the opportunity to testify in opposition specifically to Title III of H.R. 2, which was marked up in the House Foreign Affairs Committee as H.R. 1690, the Order Act. I'm glad to join you in my capacity as Ranking Member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere. Last year marked 100 years since my grandmother, Victoria Castro, came to the United States as a young orphan in the wake of the Mexican Revolution. On her paperwork, the San Antonio relatives who took her in wrote that she was coming to live. In America, she found a better life, just as many of your ancestors did, the Irish, the Germans, the English, the Spanish, immigrants with descendants in this room today. And today, we face different challenges with migration, and I don't think there's a single person in this room who believes that our current immigration system meets our country's needs. But instead of tackling these challenges head-on, Title III of this bill would institute destructive, dangerous policies that force vulnerable asylum seekers into even more desperate circumstances. When similar protocols were previously in place, human rights observers recorded thousands of violent attacks against migrants sent to Mexico, including kidnapping, rape, and other very brutal crimes. That so-called Remain in Mexico policy, as cruel as it was, included exemptions for unaccompanied minors, children, and people who don't speak Spanish. This bill includes neither of those exemptions. If H.R. 2 becomes law, asylum seekers from across the world would be required to first apply for asylum in Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador, countries that combined have less than 1/20th of the U.S. GDP. And let's be honest, many people in this room won't even drink the water when they go to these countries. Some advocates for the bill have described this as, quote, burden sharing. But the countries named in this bill cannot shoulder the same burden as the world's largest economy, our nation, nor should they be expected to. When we talk about immigration policy, I think folks often lose sight of the real people that our discussions affect. Last month in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I introduced an amendment to exempt people with disabilities, persecuted religious minorities, and even Ukrainian refugees from this bill. But every single member of the Republican majority voted it down. Under H.R. 2 as drafted, for example, if a Uyghur Muslim escapes one of China's concentration camps in Xinjiang and makes it to Mexico and seeks asylum in the United States would force that person to remain in Mexico. If a group of Cuban dissidents sail to Florida and land outside of a port of entry, they would not be allowed to apply for asylum. Under this bill, Ukrainians fleeing Russia's brutal invasion of their homeland, Catholics fleeing religious persecution in Nicaragua, and Christians or other religious minorities fleeing Iran would all be required to remain in Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador, rather than unite with family right here in the United States. Many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle have expressed concerns about how our immigration system will be able to handle a rising tide and a rising number of immigrants post-Title 42. And I agree that we need to build a more resilient and more efficient and effective system. But what we've seen time and time again is that cruel, restrictive policies like Title 42 and Remain in Mexico do not stop desperate people from fleeing persecution, oppression, and violence. This bill, sadly, is a way to get rid of a problem without solving it. And that's the best that we could hope to accomplish by passing this piece of legislation. Instead, it forces vulnerable people to take dangerous, irregular paths to the United States, the exact kind of journey that led to the deaths of 53 people in the back of a sweltering tractor trailer in my hometown of San Antonio last summer. H.R. 2 also ends humanitarian parole, except in very limited circumstances. Since the February 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, the United States, for example, has admitted 150,000 Ukrainians and their family members on humanitarian parole. If we pass H.R. 2, these families fleeing Putin's invasion would lose the ability to be in the United States. Let me say that again. They would lose the ability to be in the United States. The Afghans who fought alongside the United States and were evacuated from Kabul in August 2021 are largely in the United States through humanitarian parole. If we pass H.R. 2, they would lose the ability to remain in the United States. In February of this year, the United States evacuated 222 brave Nicaraguans who were imprisoned by the Ortega Murillo regime. They are here with their families on parole, and 2 of these individuals testified to the House Foreign Affairs Committee in March. They too would lose their status. Mr. Chairman, there are meaningful bipartisan solutions to address the causes of forced migration to the United States. And I've been proud to work across the aisle to introduce several bills that would expand the scope of U.S. foreign assistance to encourage sustainable economic development in many of these countries that we're talking about today. Unfortunately, H.R. 2 does not include any serious attempt to address the root causes of migration, and so people will keep coming. This bill is harmful and counterproductive, and it betrays our nation's legal and moral obligations to asylum seekers who deserve better, and also betrays America's legacy. Before I yield, I want to make a brief point about the rhetoric used during this debate in this Congress and also in this country. In 2019, a madman in my home state of Texas drove 10 hours to El Paso, Texas, and murdered 23 people, including American citizens, to stop what he called the Hispanic, quote, invasion. When members of Congress use their elevated platforms to dehumanize migrants and fearmonger about, quote unquote, illegals, aliens, and invasions, their words have consequences that echo far beyond these halls. The language that we use matters, and I urge members of this committee and of this Congress to be mindful about how your rhetoric can put a target on the backs of migrants and those who may target them. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this bill. I yield back.
Thank you.
Recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I happen to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, the ranking member on the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, Representative Joaquin Castro.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to H.R. 2, which should be known as the Child Deportation Act. Last year in my family marked 100 years since my grandmother, Victoria Castro, came to the United States as a young orphan in the wake of the Mexican Revolution. On her paperwork, the San Antonio relatives who took her in wrote that she was coming, quote, to live in the United States. From the discussions on the floor today, it seems that many of my colleagues have forgotten about the lives of the asylum seekers who will be affected by their legislation. Under this bill, for example, if a Uyghur Muslim family escapes from one of China's concentration camps in Xinjiang and seeks asylum in the United States by way of Mexico, they will be turned away. If a group of Cuban dissidents sail to Florida and land outside of a port of entry, they'll be turned away. Ukrainian families fleeing from Putin's state-sponsored kidnapping, Catholics fleeing religious persecution in Nicaragua, and Christians in Iran would all be required to remain in Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador at the mercy of cartels and violent gangs. Under the Trump-era Remain in Mexico policy, human rights observers recorded thousands of violent attacks against migrants, including kidnapping, rape, and other brutal crimes. That policy, as cruel as it was, included exemptions for unaccompanied minors and people who don't speak Spanish. This bill includes neither of those exemptions. H.R. 2 would also end humanitarian parole for tens of thousands of Afghan evacuees who fought side by side with our troops for over 20 years of war. These heroes and their families barely escaped from the Taliban last summer. And less than a year later, Republicans are trying to send our Afghan allies back to die. Many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle have expressed concern about how the current immigration system will be able to handle a rising tide of immigrants post-Title 42. And I agree that we need to build a more resilient, more effective, and more efficient system. But this bill is not the way to do that. Time and again, we've seen that cruel, restrictive policies like those in this bill do not stop desperate people from fleeing persecution, oppression, and violence. This bill would send the world's most vulnerable people to places where many Americans won't even drink the water. And it would force asylum seekers to take dangerous, irregular paths to the United States, the exact kind of journey that led to the deaths of 53 people in the back of a sweltering tractor trailer in my hometown of San Antonio last summer. There are meaningful bipartisan solutions to address the causes of forced migration in the United States, and I've been proud to work across the aisle to introduce several bills that would do that. But this is not the answer.
I yield the gentleman another minute.
Unfortunately, H.R. 2 does not include any serious attempt to address the root causes of migration, and it will not make any real progress to fix our nation's broken immigration system. For that reason and many others, I urge my colleagues to vote no.
Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 2.5 minutes. My amendment would prohibit federal Homeland Security funding from being diverted for Operation Lone Star, ensuring that federal Homeland Security appropriations are spent on federal operations like Border Patrol. Operation Lone Star, unfortunately, has been defined by corruption, incompetence, and cruelty. 2 years ago, the governor of my state of Texas launched Operation Lone Star, a destructive $4.5 billion political stunt that has led to a federal civil rights investigation, the tragic deaths of 8 National Guard service members, and a formal diplomatic complaint from our nation's and Texas's largest trading partner. Under the guise of border security, Governor Greg Abbott has embarked on an unprecedented campaign of government overreach, seizing private property, destroying livelihoods, and turning American border cities and towns into war zones, where helicopters buzz overhead and armed troopers pull over American citizens for looking too much like immigrants. At the beginning of the summer, Governor Abbott installed invisible razor wire in the middle of the Rio Grande and built a 1,000-foot string of floating death traps that are separated by serrated blades and secured to the riverbed with a net that is designed to catch and drown the families who reach it. During the August recess, I went down to Eagle Pass, Texas, to see the impact of Operation Lone Star for myself. Standing on the banks of the river, I could see scraps of clothing and shoes stuck in the razor wire mesh that Governor Abbott's troops have installed on the border. The wire isn't tall enough or strong enough to stop anyone who's desperate enough to cross, but it's sharp enough to leave them bloodied and broken. When families finally make it to the U.S. soil, Operation Lone Star troopers have been arresting the fathers and sons on trumped-up trespassing charges and locking them up for months at a time, some without the ability to reach their families, while busing their wives and children to cities that are thousands of miles away, and other states, including New York, Colorado, California, and Illinois. Mr. Chair, Americans want border security. They also want an efficient and orderly immigration process. Operation Lone Star interferes with that. It hurts the federal government's effort, and it damages Border Patrol's efforts. When Democrats were in the majority, we voted for billions of dollars in funding for customs and border protection and immigrations and customs enforcement. And we fought to rebuild a functioning immigration system. I'll take 30 more seconds, Mr. Speaker. And we fought to rebuild a functioning immigration system from what had been left behind by the Trump administration. But Operation Lone Star isn't border security. It's just plain out brutality. There's a difference between treating people like human beings and treating them like animals. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Texans have every right to defend and secure their borders, particularly during a time when the White House has abandoned attempts to secure the border and enforce our immigration laws. Because of the Biden administration's failed policy, states along the border, including Texas, are seeing their resources being severely depleted. They are overrun, so Governor Abbott did what most responsible, reasonable public servants would do and launched Operation Lone Star. The goal of Operation Lone Star is to stop cartels and criminals from smuggling deadly drugs and weapons and people into Texas. As of last week, the multi-agency effort resulted in 457,500 apprehensions and more than 34,400 criminal arrests, with more than 31,300 felonies reported. In the fight against fentanyl, Texas law enforcement has seized over 429 million lethal doses of fentanyl. Due to the rapid and dangerous migrant street releases in Texas, the governor has recently had to deploy additional buses to Eagle Pass and El Paso to assist those border communities overwhelmed by the influx of migrants. This is a constantly compounding issue that gets forgotten in the Beltway because it's out of sight and out of mind. This administration is putting politics over people and has completely abandoned these areas along our southwest border. If this was happening in my backyard, I want my state to step up too. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves, and the gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield a minute and a half to my good friend from Texas, Greg Casar.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We must stop the dangerous, expensive, corrupt, and ineffective political stunts at the border and instead chart a new path for a safe, orderly, and humane immigration system. Abbott's Operation Lone Star must end, and I urge passage of my good friend Mr. Castro's amendment to ensure federal funding does not go to this failed program. Every day, Texas Governor Greg Abbott violates the rights of asylum seekers and violates the rights of our border communities, all to score political points against President Biden. We have seen these inhumane policies in action that have taken the lives of children at the border, and we have lost National Guardsmen to death. This is not only inhumane, but Operation Lone Star is not effective. Abbott is lighting $25 million on fire every week to cause suffering instead of creating solutions. Why do my colleagues across the aisle not want solutions? Because they have no interest in a functioning immigration system. They thrive off of keeping the immigration system broken so they can continue to stoke anti-immigrant fears for their own politics. Operation Lone Star, furthermore, is also unconstitutional. In Arizona versus the United States, the Supreme Court ruled the federal government, not people like Governor Abbott, have supremacy over the immigration system. Abbott's unconstitutional, abusive, wasteful, and inhumane Operation Lone Star is a disgrace to our state and to our nation. I want to be clear, not 1 cent of federal money should go towards caging families, cutting innocent people with razor wire, or drowning children, period.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to yield to my friend, the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger, for as much time as he may consume.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And what a opportunity to have Texans debating Texans. And I hope that every Texan from the RGV all the way to Amarillo, from El Paso all the way to Beaumont, is listening to this debate, because the line is clear. Chaos, lawlessness, or law and order? Which is it going to be? And I do agree with my colleague who just said that the Constitution clearly says this is a federal issue. I think this is the first thing that we've agreed on. The Constitution does say that. Article 4, Section 4. Joe Biden has abdicated his responsibility. I've got the numbers from the Del Rio sector right here. Fiscal 23. This is just in Del Rio, 347,572 encounters, 144,900 known gotaways, 2,155 criminal arrests. And the gall to say that the governor of Texas doesn't have the right to protect us when the federal government has completely abdicated? I was in Eagle Pass this week. I wish that my colleagues would have been there. I wish they would have met the young lady from Venezuela who was brutally attacked by the cartel, separated from her husband, kicked in the face multiple times, 30 stitches in her head. because of the failed policies. Texas is the only government that is doing anything about this. And yet the gall to say that we don't have the right to defend ourselves when a Venezuelan flag is placed onto the shore of Texas property? You know, in any other time period in history, that would be a declaration of war. Talk to the troopers. Talk to the state troopers who are down there and see the things that they're going through, the resuscitation of a 4-year-old last week and the week before. I've had multiple Border Patrol agents tell me that the reason we have 2.3 million people who've entered this country illegally this year is because we have no consequences. 2.2 million last year. Every year since Joe Biden has been president, this chaos has gotten worse and worse. Enough is enough. I'm so glad that we are sitting here having a Texas versus Texas debate, because I hope that Texans are looking at this for what it is. The reason that this is an issue is because the President of the United States, Secretary Mayorkas, and others throughout the administration, on day one in January of 2021, reversed every single policy that worked. No more MPP, no more border wall. And to hear the falsehoods that are coming out of my colleagues about not funding Border Patrol agents, take a look at H.R. 2. Take a look at what that does to fund more agents, to put more technology into place. It's time for a shutdown of the southern border. And that's what we're calling on the president to do. This amendment should have said that we're going to reimburse the state of Texas for $5 billion this year and $5 billion last year. And I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized. The gentleman from Texas has the only time. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Cruelty, incompetence, these are what define Operation Lone Star. Unfortunately, the era that we're in American politics, for those across the aisle, is marked by fear-mongering because they have no solutions to the real issues that confront Americans: education, healthcare, jobs. Can't even get a budget together. So they try to scare everybody. They try to use these brown-skinned immigrants to scare everybody. That's what this is about. You're either going to send this money to Border Patrol, or you're going to send it to Greg Abbott so he can go on Fox News and be celebrated. I yield.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment.
Recorded vote.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Speaker. I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Castro is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. I strongly oppose Iran's efforts to develop a nuclear weapon and support efforts to stop that from happening, as we all do. In fact, we did have a working strategy to do that called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. If the JCPOA was in effect today, Iran would have had real constraints on its nuclear capability, and we would have had valuable time to figure out how to oppose its nuclear ambitions and other malign activities. I was extremely disappointed that the Trump administration decided to remove these constraints on Iran's nuclear program by violating and then withdrawing from the JCPOA. I believe that in this resolution, if we're discussing the threat that Iran's nuclear program poses, we need to be honest about how and why we got here. I additionally have some reservations about the language in this resolution. In particular, the language that states that the United States must, quote, use all means necessary to prevent Iran from attaining a nuclear weapon. That language is categorical, and my concern is it could be construed as language of an AUMF. I understand the value in making statements like this to provide leverage, but that's only relevant if there's an active diplomatic process to provide Iran an alternative. We must bring Iran back to the table, and I'm disappointed that this language is not paired with a strong call for diplomacy so Iran has an opportunity to avoid conflict. I yield back, Chairman.
Gentleman yields. This resolution is simply one of to make it clear what the policy of the United States is and to provide deterrence, to allow the diplomats then to do their job. It seems to me if the Congress states unequivocally that a nuclear Iran is not acceptable, that will only empower our diplomats when they go to the negotiating table. Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Castro.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony. And Mr. Wolf, during your time in the Trump administration at DHS, you oversaw the design and implementation of the monstrous and cruel family separation policy, tearing children away from their families, many of whom are yet to be reunited with their parents. Here are a few examples of those kids that you ripped from their families. You suppressed a DHS report about the dangers of white supremacy. Your tenure at DHS was marred with significant ethical and legal concerns. Your communications during January 6th mysteriously disappeared. And there are serious ethical questions about your relationship with a lobbying firm. You explicitly defied congressional subpoenas to testify in front of the then Democratic Congress, yet you've shown up today voluntarily, yet feel comfortable testifying here today. Federal courts even ruled that your tenure as quote-unquote acting secretary of DHS was illegal. In your testimony, you've described many of President Biden's efforts as quote-unquote illegal. But I find it ironic that we should trust you on what is lawful given your extensive disregard for American law. So let's discuss one of those egregious policies you implemented that was eventually struck down by American courts. Mr. Wolf, you were one of the key architects of the Trump administration's efforts to separate families at the border. Children as young as 4 months were mercilessly taken from their parents, with almost 1,000 children still not reunited with their families years later, even though the Biden administration set up a task force to reunite them. I'm a father of 3 kids, a 9-year-old daughter, a 7-year-old son, and an 18-month-old daughter. Do you have kids, Mr. Wolf?
I do.
What you did is unimaginable, unimaginable, inhumane, and despicable. And quite frankly, I'm surprised the chairman invited you to be here today. Yet earlier this week, when you were asked about revisiting family separations, you said that, quote, all options need to be on the table. As we all know, we're having an important debate about immigration in the Congress and for the presidency. So I'd like to ask you an important question. I'd like a yes or no answer. I'd like you to be a straight shooter. You are from Texas, after all. Would you advise this or a future administration to once again separate families as the Trump administration did?
So I will stand by my statement that you, I think, quoted earlier, that all options should be on the table. But what I would say is that there are a number of effective programs, including MPP and others that I'm sure we'll talk about, that address the situation along that border. And the crisis that we faced in 18 is very different than the crisis that we face today.
So that means that you do think that it should be considered and possibly used.
That's not my response.
For the record here, I'll remind you, Mr. Wolf, that what you did is inhumane. And I'll be requesting that the Biden administration release all documents related to family separation policy, and we'll settle the matter once and for all on your involvement in that policy. I also want to ask you another important question. It's often the case that folks who give testimony before Congress, folks who served in one administration, if there is a second administration, they will often serve again. That's true for Democrats and Republicans. There's a chance that if President Trump is elected to office, that you might be considered to serve in the administration again, regardless of what my opinion or the opinion of others here may be of you. So, Mr. Wolf, do you or your organization support the use of military force in Mexico, even without the consent of the Mexican government, as many leading Republican officials have called for?
I've been on record as supporting all hands or all options should be on the table when we look at the threat of cartels and the violence against Americans.
So you might counsel a yes?
I think all options should be considered. This idea of taking options off the table for a variety of different policy issues
Let
that
me-
we
let me
have
reclaim my
addressed,
time.
it makes no
You've done-
sense.
come on, you've
And
done
I
this
should say,
before.
all
Let me
the other
reclaim my
things that
time.
you leveled against me
Mr. Wolf,
are all just absurd on their face.
Listen, your
I'm happy to address
America
any of
First
those.
Policy Institute is closely related with President Trump. So I just have one final question for you and your colleague, if you wish to answer it. What happens to the America First Policy Institute if President Trump goes to prison?
The America First Policy Institute will continue to be around for hundreds of years. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chairman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Wilson.
Thank you very much, Chairman Mike McCall, and we appreciate